Thanks for having me. It's really wonderful to be here, and we've got a whole bunch to talk about. I certainly want to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions and answers and broader communal discussion. But before we get into sort of the meat and potatoes of today, I've gotten a lot of questions over the last couple months as I've sort of put myself out there as a bit of a vocal critic around what motivates me and why I feel as strongly as I do about the things that I do. And so it seems worthwhile, especially in a room full of people I don't know, to try to give y'all a little background about myself, and so that you can get a sense of where I'm coming from and see, I would suspect that we may share some things in common, and sort of get some sense of my perspective. So for me, my first psychedelic experience was when I was 18 years old, took mushrooms in a university setting. Ultimately, I had friends who had gotten a hold of mushrooms and were like, hey, we think these are things that you'd really like, you should check them out. And I had bought into the drug war propaganda from the time I was a little kid. When I was 15, I tried cannabis and sort of realized that it wasn't all it was cracked up to be as far as the propaganda that had been shared with me. But I was still really hesitant about psychedelics, and I was concerned that I would do damage to my brain. So I was intrigued by their offer of this compound, these mushrooms, and I did my best to inform myself. I went to the library, started pulling old research papers from the 60s. It was 2006. The Hopkins paper on psilocybin occasioning mystical experiences had come out a few months prior. I read that. I was on Wikipedia. I was on Erowid. I spent about 2 weeks hoovering up pretty much everything I could get my hands on. And at the end of those 2 weeks, it seemed to me that it was a really fascinating experience, and it didn't seem to have a whole lot of risk. So I went ahead and I ate an eighth, and I walked out onto the woods, kind of bordering the edge of campus. And right at about an hour in, as everything was starting to peak, I came across this tree that had fallen across the path I was on, and all of a sudden, the first thought in my mind was dead tree. And instantly, it was like there was this other presence that kind of entered my consciousness and began steering it. And all of a sudden, I saw there were, ants and beetles running up and down the log, that there was fungi and moss, lichen, that there was this whole dance of life happening. And suddenly, in this gasp of ecstatic realization, it was like, look, none of this starts or stops in any concrete place or time. And look, you're part of it. And it felt as though I'd entered a nature documentary. It felt as though I was part of this dance of life and death. And for me, my earliest memories were my grandmother dying, visiting her in the hospital as she was dealing with terminal breast cancer and grappling with what does it mean to stop being conscious, what does it mean to die, from the time I was 3, and having tons of sleepless nights, agonizing over what was going to happen to me. In this moment, all of that anxiety was gone. And, it turned out that it stayed gone for 6 months afterwards. And, talking with my parents, they were totally floored, just wondering what had happened to me. But in that moment, I had probably a 10 or 15 minute pure unitive experience of oneness, timeless presence. And it was beautiful. In that moment and following that moment, I knew that things would never be the same. But even while I was still tripping, as I came down from that experience, I started to look around. I started to think about areas that were more broad than just this little patch of woods that I was in. I started to realize that all of the ecologies on Earth are interconnected, that these systems of interconnected webs of life were actually under assault on a daily basis, that industrial civilization was presenting a dire threat to many of these systems, and that just because I was on this small little patch of somewhat cordoned off, ecological wildness, if we could even call it that, on the edge of this university campus, that this had sort of been maintained despite this onslaught. I was at university in order to attain papers to function in a world that was reproducing these atrocities. And so my next thought was, well, hell, where can I go to get away from this? How can I not be a part of this? And so instantly I thought, well, I could maybe eke out some sort of living on the edge of a national forest or park, something like that. And then I realized, well, wait, homelessness and vagrancy are criminalized acts. That puts me at risk of running into cops, running into people who may not be particularly happy that I've chosen to disconnect in that way. And so that means personally, I'm at jeopardy. But also, even if I could manage to eke out some sort of meager subsistence in that arena, essentially, I wouldn't be safe in the event that life support systems fail on spaceship Earth, that there is nowhere to escape, that we're all in this together. And so when I realized that, it was suddenly shifted from this question of what do I do to escape from this to what can I do to resist all of this? How can I function in a world that seems so intent on commodifying everything, turning it into a product, and ultimately devouring itself? And for me, those were fundamental thoughts that really sat with me in the wake of that experience. And despite feeling like I'd had this existential weight, this fear of death lifted off of my shoulder for months in the wake of that experience, these other questions about how to be in the world and how to make meaning for myself in the face of some of this onslaught really continued to ricochet around my head. And so this question of integration loomed pretty large for me. How do I continue to live with the things that I've seen? How do I find meaningful engagement? What can I do with the insights that have been offered? And in that moment for me, the thing that seemed self-apparent was more psychedelic engagement, more questioning around these substances. They had provided some of these catalysts, so perhaps they had, if not answers, at least insights. Perhaps they had considerations for how to be in the world, unique approaches, perhaps things that weren't being offered via other channels. And so I started, or continued to do, a whole bunch of research. I found myself engaging on internet forums. I found myself on Wikipedia pretty much every day, going through various chemical profiles. I found myself on Erowid. And this all became pretty much part and parcel through discovering DMT. And for me, when I discovered DMT, it was so ontologically shattering. It forced so much reconsideration about what I knew or thought I knew about the world around me that about 3 months into a period of fairly heavy use, I was trying to get something out of me. I was trying to figure out some way to offload all of these questions. And I found myself on Google, not expecting any coherent answer, but I typed in something along the lines of, how is it possible to encounter disincarnate entities on DMT? And I figured I'd get gibberish in response, maybe some ads or something like that. And instead, I found myself, the first result was a page from the DMT Nexus. And here was a group of people that were talking very coherently, inquisitively even, about these experiences, trying to cobble together some sort of insight, some sort of functional understanding about what the experience might offer. And I realized, wow, there are folks who are approaching this in really serious ways, who are trying to see if there's traction in the real world, if these compounds can actually offer meaningful ways of engaging with everything around us. And so I dove in. And while participating in the Nexus, on the Nexus, I found myself open to a whole bunch of questions. And we took a very anarchic approach. Pretty much research questions that interested folks were posed to a broader forum. We figured out what capacities we had, and sort of through no other means than general interest, we realized we had access to plants and laboratories and people with the capabilities of working some of these machines. And we started cobbling together a whole host of analytical data, safety profiles, extraction techniques. And I was floored to realize that, folks that just had interest and questions about these substances were actually able to collaborate in ways where we put together databases that outclassed things that existed in some of the peer-reviewed literature. We were invited to share our findings in places. We had people turning to us for insight around compounds or plants, for example, that Richard Evans Schultes had collected and then lost. So for me, it was really apparent that it wasn't necessary to have government sanctions or institutional credentials in order to carry out legitimate and valuable psychedelic research. And I would contend that, and I went on to contend that a lot of the work that we did was incredibly valuable and had a lot to offer to broader communities through its harm reduction values. And I would realize when I saw the document offered later that we were essentially practicing open science. Open science, there's essentially sort of four main principles. The notion of maintaining intellectual and scientific integrity, placing the common good above private gain, not withholding materials or knowledge for commercial advantage, and placing discoveries into the public domain for the benefit of all. And one of the things I found really interesting about the work that we did is even when we relied on peer-reviewed papers, even when we relied on institutional knowledge, we could approach those researchers and ask them to share with us. If we found stuff that was behind paywalls, we could either pirate it ourselves or reach out to the original authors and ask them to share their insights and data, because most of them aren't affiliated with the publishers that are setting up the paywalls in front of that research. And in fact, with a bunch of our laboratory analysis, we had partnerships with sanctioned labs that were very interested in the questions that we were asking, that didn't have grant funding to do what we wanted to do. But as long as we made it easy for them, they were certainly happy to facilitate the sort of questions that we wanted to answer. And so as I pursued all of this, I ended up writing this paper called Criminals and Researchers, where I essentially argued that there was a whole lot to be gained from the notion of underground researchers working with sanctioned folks. And that, to my mind, the sort of questions that could be asked in the underground, questions that might not get IRB approval, questions that might seem a little more out there than the traditional research institution might be willing to ask, but that researchers were nonetheless interested in, could be carried out by folks who had the interest and the capabilities, and that through dialogue with sanctioned researchers, some of these relationships could be strengthened and that really interesting questions could be asked. And so I bring this up because over the recent months of offering criticisms about sanctioned researchers and MAPS, and that's the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and other organizations, certain people have accused me of being against sanctioned psychedelic research, and I would contend nothing could be further from the truth. I think that sanctioned psychedelic research can actually be opened up a lot wider than it has been, and personally, I'd like to see that to whatever extent possible. So I'd like to take a moment and sort of transition to questions about mainstreaming and look at why drugs are illegal in the US. And I would contend there's a number of systemic reasons. So we can see that there are issues of white supremacy. In fact, we have quotes such as, "The primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effect on degenerate races." We see police departments putting in for larger caliber handguns and bullets, claiming that they're needed in order to stop cocaine-crazed Negroes. We have issues of imperialism. For example, John Ehrlichman, an advisor to Nixon, stated that while they understood that they couldn't make it illegal to be black or against the war, they could in fact criminalize the substances that were being used by those groups of people and use those as a pretense in order to go after those groups, to arrest their leaders, disrupt their movements and activities, and ultimately to criminalize them in ways that were not necessarily constitutional. He finishes a quote on this by saying, "Did we know that drugs were not the problem at all?" Absolutely. We see issues of misogyny, where this is a quote from Nixon, who said, "Homosexuality, dope, immorality in general are the enemies of strong societies." So we see this notion of homosexuality and drugs being tied together and being presented as antithetical to a desirable society. And finally, I would contend that we see that psychedelics in particular are not necessarily conducive to producing widgets and a functioning capitalist society. Now, obviously, we're seeing some of this narrative turned on its ear with trends around microdosing and the notion that microdosing psychedelics can actually boost productivity. And I would say it's not for nothing that there's a reason why all of a sudden microdoses and LSD and little tiny amounts of mushrooms are being seen as acceptable by certain significant players within broader society, and it has to do exactly with their role in productivity. So with that being said, I'd like to take a moment and think about legitimacy and authority, right? Because that's ultimately what we're talking about if we're discussing substances and their criminality and their role within society. So first and foremost, dominant culture and the state are predicated on coercion and violence. If we trace United States capitalism back to its core, we find that slavery and genocide are fundamental to it. Ultimately, authority is not self-justifying. That means if somebody has a reason for telling you not to do something or telling you that something needs to be a certain way, there should be a solid justification for that. One example we might consider is that if a small child attempts to run out into the street, you would feel totally justified in grabbing them and preventing them from running out into traffic. You have a justifiable, legitimate reason from preventing that. However, in the case of psychedelics, these things weren't criminalized by accident, and they weren't criminalized due to any sort of evidence around their potential harm or safety profiles or anything of that nature. So there's really no legitimate reason for authority to say, hey, these can't be used. In fact, it's a purely political reason. And so, as a result, I would contend that psychedelics belong in the public domain, and really any sort of use, whether we're talking therapeutic, recreational, spiritual, or any other, is really legitimate as long as it's not hurting people. So with that, I think it makes sense to look at this project of mainstreaming. And mainstreaming is something that's been underway for the last couple decades, but perhaps gaining steam in the past 5 years or so. And I would contend that mainstreaming is ultimately respectability politics meant to assuage dominant culture, meant to show that, hey, psychedelic values and psychedelic culture really fits in with the dominant paradigm. You don't have anything to worry about psychedelic users. In fact, they won't present any disruption to the established order. So please, legalize psychedelics, we won't make problems. And so I would contend that in order to make that happen, we have to see the whitewashing and homogenization of marginalized perspectives. So folks who are not included within dominant culture, and these are things like patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, those of us who are perhaps treated poorly by these systems are being asked to forget that, give that up, surrender any sort of antagonistic stance towards those systems and institutions that threaten our well-being. We're also going to see, as far as mainstreaming goes, the commercialization of substances. That's because mainstream really functions in a capitalist context, and so markets are sort of the avenue through which everything is conceived of. Things have legitimacy in actual markets of capital. Things are considered to be traded on the marketplace of ideas. There's no real way where psychedelics can enter into mainstream if they are anything other than commodities, as that's how things gain legitimacy, traction, and trade value. And so, in part as a result of that, and in part because it's convenient to do so, we can also expect to see the flattening and commodification of culture. And one really simple and personally grating little meme around that is, if you've ever seen an email from MAPS, it signs off saying support psychedelic science. And when you read that email, you understand that support psychedelic science ultimately means give MAPS money. And for me, I find that really grating because I've been a part of a whole bunch of psychedelic science and research efforts that haven't required giving MAPS money. And I would contend that presenting this little tagline actually flattens and does a disservice to what psychedelic science is, and to the fact that we're all capable of participating in it, and that I think, personally, the field is much richer when we all participate in it and share alike, and try to create as diverse an ecology of psychedelic research as possible. So obviously, or I would assume it's obvious by now, I think that mainstreaming is a mistake because I think it creates pretty significant problems and isolates a bunch of us, marginalizes our voices even further than they are in dominant culture. And if we consider dominant culture, we can see that it's literally presenting an existential threat to life on this planet. Ultimately, if we're going to make assertions about how psychedelics can improve our lives and the world around us, we need to exist in the world in order to implement those changes. So if dominant culture is posing a threat, for example, through climate change or nuclear proliferation, militarism, things like these, in the event we align psychedelics with dominant culture and let those things sort of lead towards their logical conclusion, it seems really unlikely that any of us are going to be around long enough to see psychedelics actually affect positive change. Additionally, if people are going to make the assertion that psychedelics can cure or alleviate the afflictions of dominant culture, I would say we should expect them to be able to provide historical or current evidence to support their claims. If they can't support those claims, then I would contend that it's meaningless propaganda. And so if we consider some of the recent assertions around psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and if we can just get it to enough people and scale up quick enough, that then once those people have been treated by some unknown mechanism, they will facilitate grand global change, I would contend that personally, that sounds really similar to the logic of Abby Hoffman saying before the Chicago Democratic Convention, hey, just put it in the water and everything will get better. And speaking of propaganda, I think it takes a moment to look at this quote by Noam Chomsky, who said, "The point of public relations slogans like support our troops is that they don't mean anything. That's the whole point of good propaganda. You want to create a slogan that nobody's going to be against and everybody's going to be for. Nobody knows what it means because it doesn't mean anything. Its crucial value is that it diverts your attention from a question that does mean something. Do you support our policy? That's the one you're not allowed to talk about." And so if we consider the media attention and hype around the use of psychedelics for PTSD in veterans, I think we can see some of this support the troops mentality at play. And in fact, Rick Doblin and some other key characters have told us that part of the reason that they're interested in reaching out to the troops, part of the reason they're interested in reaching out to police forces and people who've been historically tough on crime is because they feel that this creates this sort of political atmosphere that's kind of untouchable, right? Like these are assertions you can make, these are groups you can reach out to that will sort of broaden the psychedelic coalition. But I would contend in doing that, there's no real consideration about what that research facilitates. There's no question or no questioning around what does it mean if the US government can turn around and tell its populace, hey, don't worry about the effects on our troops. We can bring them home and treat them and reintegrate them into society. So you don't have to worry about what they're doing to all those populations abroad. It really doesn't matter, and it won't affect you when we bring them home anyway. Similarly, if we consider the use of MDMA for maintenance therapies, perhaps in drone operators or significant segments or similar segments of the military, it seems that there is at least some potential that these compounds could be used to support rather horrific military offensives by the US. And if we consider the fact that the majority of enlisted folks who commit suicide haven't actually been deployed, it seems like there's a pretty significant profit motive for the United States Army to be able to deploy maintenance therapies and maintain its investment in these various troops. So I think that there's a few issues with the medical model that haven't really been considered as far as how it's being deployed more broadly. And first and foremost is the fact that the legitimacy of the medical community is really predicated on prohibitionist logic. So as we've seen, there was no real logical or scientific basis for the criminalization of psychedelics. So when psychedelic therapists or researchers say, oh wait, we're actually capable of dealing with these incredibly dangerous substances. Like, yes, they're Schedule I and we accept that, but we're actually the professions that are best outfitted to deal with these dangerous compounds. They've sort of already ceded that to prohibitionist logic. In fact, we know that these are not particularly dangerous and they don't present the threat that would lead them to be reasonably classified as Schedule I. Additionally, I'm pretty floored by the number of therapists who will talk at great length and in pretty odd manners about the fact that when they see their patients, psychedelics actually seem to affect something very close to a cure for many of the issues that their patients are seeing. And rather than seeing ongoing symptom management, they're just blown away by the fact that a couple therapy sessions brings them that close to cured. And so to me, it feels kind of jaw-dropping that when we look at the larger systemic approach of this, we're focused on the individual. There's this focus on, if we can fix each of these individuals and send them back into society, somehow things will get better. And to me, that looks like systemic symptoms management, that rather than engaging with some sort of cultural cure and trying to fix the underlying causes of why these folks are traumatized or dealing with all of these other things, instead we're trying to treat each individual on their own terms as though there's nothing going on that's that toxic on a much broader scale. Additionally, we see issues where medicine is and has been systemically classist and racist. Notable examples include Henrietta Lacks, the Tuskegee Airmen. Looking through the histories, it's pretty brutal, some of the experimentation that has gone on in the name of medical science. And I would contend that when people assert that professional medical approaches are the only legitimate way to do something, particularly around psychedelics, I think there are broad enough histories and ongoing issues that are problematic enough that I wouldn't say that sanctioned medicine has no place, but I think that it's really important to be aware and to be able to have discussions about lack of access and other problems that have taken place throughout medical history. And finally, I don't think that psychedelics belong purely in the medical arena. I don't think that psychedelics are solely about curing ill people, but they have a whole bunch of other things to offer those of us who are perhaps not dealing with any illness whatsoever. That being said, I would like to take some time, the rest of the talk, and sort of look at what medicalization of psychedelics can look like. And for this, we're going to focus on a single company. This is a company called Compass Pathways, which is a venture capital-backed for-profit company that's looking to develop psilocybin therapies for treatment-resistant depression. And to kick things off, we'll take a look at how venture capital-backed corporations work. Essentially, they're incentivized to place money over everything. They generate value via intellectual property, goods and services, selling those things, licensing those things, figuring out broader market engagement with those categories. And when we look at the way that these companies are set up, we can see that they have venture capitalist investors who require a return on investment. That's literally why they invest in the first place. There's a promise that they will be able to make profit on their investment. So if they're going to make profit on their investment, that requires an exit strategy or a way of getting their money out plus that additional percentage. And so we should understand that in any company that's VC-backed, that we're looking at an exit strategy, right? We're looking at an eventual initial public offering or a big pharma buyout, life sciences buyout. And if we consider the way that intellectual property is wielded within the arena of big pharma and life sciences company, we should understand that that likely means that none of us will be able to get direct benefits from that these things will ultimately sit behind paywalls or other restrictions. Now, in addition to being a venture capital-backed company, it also appears that Compass is looking at vertically integrating. And vertical integration is a pretty simple concept. Essentially, in the case of a psychedelic therapy company, you would be looking at controlling the supply chain from synthesis through therapy. And we've actually seen some approaches to this where Compass has an exclusivity agreement with their manufacturer Onyx for GMP psilocybin, which prevents other research teams and institutions from obtaining psilocybin from Onyx. They could obtain psilocybin from other companies. At this moment, nobody else is producing GMP psilocybin as far as I know. So this is actually presenting a real material obstruction to research teams that have been ready to go for quite a bit of time and are currently in the US hemorrhaging money, waiting on finding another source. So we see that in fact Compass is currently denying access, and when you have control of that supply chain and when you are a first mover or early mover on some of these terrains, you are given incredible advantages through your ability to deny access, which ultimately makes you more viable as a company competing with other companies. And so once you're able to deny access, that means that you can utilize value-based pricing to maximize your profits. Value-based pricing means that rather than pricing something based on what it costs and a reasonable profit margin, you can essentially set that value based on what the marketplace demands. So we've seen this in cannabis already, right? Where one of the CBD seizure medicines, the first one that was approved by the FDA, was actually set at $32,500 a year for its fair price. And the CEO of that company used Martin Shkreli logic and said, actually, the reason why we're setting this at this price, even though we could afford to sell it for much cheaper, is because $32,500 fits in with about the market of anti-seizure meds anyway. So even though we could afford to sell it for less, we're not going to. If we imagine this with psilocybin therapy, we can imagine Compass, say, if they could afford to sell them for $2,000 a year to an insurance company, and the insurance company is instead currently paying $10,000 a year for standard TRD treatments, Compass could set the price at $8,000 a year. Now, the insurer is going to see a savings of $2,000 per patient per year. Compass is going to see a hell of a lot more profit on $8,000 a year than $2,000. But ultimately, we're the people who pay insurance premiums. And it seems pretty simple to argue that a premium for an $8,000 a year therapy is going to be significantly higher than $2,000 a year. So we're ultimately left out of the equation. And as we see throughout capitalism, we see the privatization of benefits, the socialization of costs, but we also see the monopolization of markets and the manipulation of prices as a result of this vertical integration. So Compass is a company that was founded by George Goldsmith and his wife, Katya Malevskaya. I'm going to give a brief background of the board. These are just a few people. As you can see, David Norton was a former group chairman of Johnson & Johnson. Marco Mowinkle was the global head of Janssen, who you might remember, both Janssen and Johnson & Johnson, from their role in the opioid epidemic. Chris Strutt was in an executive role at GlaxoSmithKline. Stu Stansfield was formerly at Janssen. The reason I have her on here is because she was also involved in an RIMA project at Quintiles. If you're familiar with ayahuasca and harmine and harmaline, you may be aware that those are reverse inhibitors of monoamine oxidase, or RIMA. Now, I don't have evidence at this point that Compass is actively looking to medicalize ayahuasca. However, I do know that MAPS has been interested in medicalizing both iboga and ayahuasca, and given some of their interrelationship with Compass, I do think it begs the question, or is at least a very interesting coincidence, that Sue Stansfield is on the board, given that past expertise and given the potential for expansion around medicalized psychedelics. And one more character that's worth noting is Thomas Longren. He was the former executive director of the EMA, which is the European equivalent to the FDA. Now, while he was the head of the EMA, he actually set up a consultancy business to advise different pharmaceutical industry clients while he was still employed as the head of the EMA. Now, he was called out by a number of watchdogs who raised clear ethical problems with his role, or his dual roles, and actually ended up leaving the EMA 2 months after he started that consultancy. However, there was no mechanism for any sort of punishment or addressing these these issues. So aside from seeing several watchdogs raise questions and say that there was a major conflict of interest and serious concerns, there was no actual closure to this broader issue, and he's now working on the Compass board. If we look at who Compass was, initially, they were a nonprofit organization that reached out to a number of psychedelic researchers. They started sort of digging around those research networks, asking for protocols, asking for information, asking for people to share information, because they were going to be starting a psychedelic hospice center on the Isle of Man. And at one point, they were planning on doing so with the Eleusis Public Benefit Corporation. Now, Eleusis has applied in the past for a patent for LSD for the treatment of Alzheimer's. Don't really have time to get into them. Their head is Shlomi Raz. There's a little bit of information online. If you're curious, you can Google and see what you can find. But one of the things I found really interesting about their focus on the Isle of Man is that the Isle of Man is a tax haven and is known for being kind of lax with their regulatory rules. In fact, a number of new industries have moved to Isle of Man, particularly because their regulators are willing to accommodate industry. So for me, it raised a number of questions as far as, given the seriousness with which psychedelic organizations in the US have approached the regulators, why there would be the willingness to sort of jeopardize some of these rigorous standards and start engaging in an environment like that. Now, additionally, George and Katja early on identified themselves as key donors and strategists for MAPS and Hefter, which again, I found kind of confusing considering that they were making this claim within a couple years of entering the psychedelic terrain, and it seemed as though they were trying to sell themselves as they were setting up some of this framework, or attempting to. And they had this explicit focus on regulatory bodies, economic development, corporate governance, and things that to me seemed radically different from most of the other approaches we could see from psychedelic research institutions. For example, when they reached out to the Isle of Man, they didn't reach out to the healthcare folks, they reached out to their director of economic development. And so as I looked into Compass, I found their 990s from before they switched to their for-profit, which they closed saying, Compass is currently in the process of winding down following difficulties in raising funds through a charitable structure. Now, they told MAPS the following year that they actually had a conundrum, and that conundrum was, do we pursue this as a for-profit or not-for-profit endeavor? We consulted and decided the market would support a for-profit. European government will offer tax credits on the sale of psilocybin or 16% of the investment in developing the drug, and this is to incentivize and boost UK companies. Now, for me, this started to raise pretty significant questions about their narrative. Did they get out of the nonprofit because it wasn't viable? Or did they start a for-profit because there was actually real good incentives to? Well, it gets even more interesting because in a recent Quartz article, Compass told them that the reason that they decided to go for-profit was because we believe the latter is the best vehicle for developing psilocybin therapy on a large scale for patients in need in a sustainable manner. So now it appears that there's kind of three narratives about why they felt they had to go for profit, which to my mind raises pretty significant questions about what the actual narrative is, which one is the truth, and how these things can possibly coexist. Now it gets even more interesting when we consider that on June 3rd of 2016, George Goldsmith told a room full of psychedelic researchers and enthusiasts at the Interdisciplinary Conference for Psychedelic Research in the Netherlands that Compass was actually very invested in open science approaches. And it was precisely for that reason that Compass had been set up as a not-for-profit medical research organization. Now, 10 days later, Compass filed in the UK through Companies House as they filed the for-profit version. That was on June 13th, 2016. This, of course, is further compounded. We'll get to that in a second. So this raises questions about whether or not Compass was a legitimate charity. We see that George and Katja poured about $500,000 into that charity, that they simultaneously built the connections that they used by their for-profit while they were getting this nonprofit together, that they continued to spend charity funds after establishing the for-profit, and that it appears that they transferred $142,000 worth of intellectual property from the charity to themselves. Now, in the US, it's illegal to advance personal or for-profit interests via a nonprofit, and two law professors who've looked over these documents say that they present questions that should be answered by Compass, and in the event they can't be answered by Compass, they claim that it would warrant further investigation from the California Attorney General. Katja has authored a piece that will supposedly be appearing in the upcoming Winter MAPS Bulletin, where she asserts that she and George decided to start the for-profit in February of 2017. Now, not only have we seen that that's actually not the case, and she contradicts herself in this piece of writing, it's also worth noting that George and Katja have given MAPS $175,000 since 2013. In that context, I think it's pretty important to ask the question of whether or not MAPS is planning on running sponsored content in their winter bulletin. I would suggest that the fact that there's been such a large sum of money given, and given that looking through the MAPS bulletin, it doesn't seem like the average person or even researcher would have the opportunity to make third-party business PR claims in that bulletin, that precisely what we will see if this runs should be considered to be sponsored content. Now, I also think a question worth asking is around the narrative that's being used as far as why George and Katja became interested in psychedelic research. In fact, they've asserted repeatedly that they never had any interest in psychedelics until their son, who was dealing with depression, had an underground therapy session with a psilocybin provider. That narrative, of course, belies the fact that their initial research endeavors were all around psychedelic hospice, not the use of psilocybin for TRD, and I think raises pretty significant questions about what their history is with psychedelics, if they have personal interest and engagement, and really what's driving their research and their motivations. And finally, I think it has to be asserted that even though Compass keeps insisting it's focusing on issues of access and equity and using these other buzzwords, there's no way of getting around the fact that they also keep highlighting the fact that the treatment-resistant depression market is quite large and apparently quite profitable. So, looking at who's funded Compass, we can see their three seed investors were Peter Thiel, Christian Angermeyer, and Mike Novogratz. All of these folks knew each other from endeavors that they'd taken in the cryptocurrency realm and had actually worked together on a specific cryptocurrency and blockchain product. I don't have time to go into that at the moment, but there's some interesting connections there. Instead, I'll take a moment and focus on Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel is said to have invested in Compass via his company Thiel Capital. In fact, that's not the case. If you look at the company's house documents again, we find that it's a company called Rivendell 2017-9. Now, a number of people, including Rick Doblin, have claimed that Thiel probably has no clue that he's invested any money whatsoever in Compass. Well, one of the interesting things is that Rivendell is the same name as and he's got a whole host of these Rivendell investment companies. Rivendell is the company that he used when he sold his personal shares in Facebook. I would contend that the use of the Rivendell investment company might actually indicate that he's quite aware that he has money invested in Compass. Additionally, he's stated that when it comes to business, ideally you shouldn't try to compete, you should try to have a monopoly. He's got this, one of the most terrifying surveillance apparatus currently known to humanity. So this company called Palantir, essentially what it is an artificial intelligence program that concatenates and streamlines big data. So it would go through all sorts of public records, social media, pretty much anything that it could find on an individual, and make a nice, very user-friendly interface for an operator to go through and put together all of the connections that a single individual might have. This technology has been used in numerous drug busts, for example, in New Orleans, where the actual city council had no clue that its police department was utilizing this software and was pretty horrified to find out. It's also been used in countless ICE deportations. I would also suggest, if you have the interest, you should read his 2009 speech to the Cato Institute, where he decries democracy, laments women getting the right to vote, suggests social safety nets ought to be shredded, and pines for the 1920s as the last time in America that anybody had anything to be politically optimistic about. Now, if you're familiar with American history, you may be aware that the 1920s were the Gilded Age of robber barons, and it was not really a pretty picture. So I would contend that Peter Thiel's vision for society at whole is pretty scary and actually drives a number of terrifying economic vehicles that would actually lead to greater social trauma on a variety of scales, but I don't have time to get into that. It's also worth looking at this guy named Christian Angermeyer, who's a German investor. I believe his background was as a film producer, and he's the person behind a company called Atai. Atai is a life sciences investment company that he's stated he's hoping will unleash the virgin market for psychedelics. Now, Atai has raised about $25 million for Compass. They own about 25% of Compass. They're also the largest investor in a company called Inaplexis, which is also doing blockchain technology for healthcare, big data, and a bunch of other kind of interesting things. Again, not enough time to go into that, but he's been invested directly. He's now invested through Atai, and a number of other Compass partners also appear to be investing through Atai, sort of as the vehicle to get back into Compass. And finally, there's a company called Tapestry Networks. Now, Tapestry Networks is a really interesting company, and we can see that back in 2017, they loaned about $500,000 to Compass. Tapestry Networks is actually George Goldsmith's prior company. And if we look into Tapestry Networks, we see that they have quite a few troubling connections. Now, Goldsmith and the rest of Tapestry would claim that they're not actually a lobbying group. In fact, what they are is a professional services firm that sets up neutral networks in order to facilitate better interactions between industry and regulators. And we can see that the models used by Tapestry were actually to have industry players pay for these networks, where Tapestry then took that money and brought regulators out or used, according to the letter of the law, supposedly ethical means to facilitate these dialogues. But drilling down into some of these dynamics becomes really fascinating. So there's this guy, this professor at Harvard named Karthik Ramana. He's literally written the book on what he calls thin political markets. Thin political markets are areas within capitalism where industry requires such specialized knowledge in order to regulate it, at least according to industry, that nobody should be allowed to regulate it except industry, because they're the only people who could possibly understand all of the complexities. So it would be problematic if anyone but them tried to do anything about it. In that context, this same professor actually did a Harvard Business School case study dealing with Tapestry, and dealing with Tapestry's role in bringing together financial institutions and regulators in the wake of the 2008 financial crash, highlighting some of the cozy relationships they facilitated between industry and regulators. So this was their Bank Governance Leadership Network. This network was funded solely by Ernst & Young, or EY. If you're not familiar with them, they're one of the big four financial firms. They kind of make some of these large capital systems run smoothly. They handle a wide variety of services, and they're sort of at this bottleneck within global capitalism. Now, interestingly, according to this paper, BGLN developed a reputation for fostering trust between regulators and banks. I would suggest in the wake of the 2008 financial crash, there was no reason for there to be trust between regulators and banks. Furthermore, for the several years that Tapestry was being used by EY, they were actually their second largest expense behind their lawyers. Now, again, I would assert that companies as large and influential as EY don't really spend that kind of money unless they're getting something for their outlay. Finally, there's this issue where Ted Price, who was a regulator, financial regulator, who went on to advise Tapestry at a later date, sort of highlighting the revolving door between industry and regulators, said that Tapestry's involvement in these meetings was such a soft sell that for a long time he'd thought Tapestry was simply a brand of EY, not a separate entity. So we can sort of see the strategies that are being used and why they might be problematic around regulatory issues. Now, in that context, it's worth noting that Tapestry also promoted this European healthcare network. Now, in addition to this, they also have networks around fracking. They've had networks around military contractors and a variety of others. I would contend pharma is of particular relevance to the questions of Compass. And this network was funded by a number of pharma companies, AstraZeneca and the rest of them. And one of the things that I found interesting, that in addition to having these various firms pay the fees that allowed for the network to take place, each one of these firms was actually implicated in Science Magazine's investigation into what they called pay-later conflicts of interest for FDA advisors. So pretty much if you had a group of advisors that was approving a particular pharmaceutical, rather than these firms paying those advisors up front, the advisors would approve the drug and then suddenly their next research project would be funded. or they would have honorariums and travel expenditures funded for conferences that they wanted to attend. And despite the fact that this is clearly unethical, the FDA still hasn't put anything on the books about regulating this sort of behavior. So Tapestry would be totally within their rights to assert that the letter of the law has been maintained, no laws whatsoever have been broken, and so this is totally legal and unproblematic behavior. Personally, I would contend that even if it's completely legal, it's clearly quite problematic. The Tapestry website has a number of really interesting documents on it. White papers around fracking, their military networks, this Beyond the Pill document, or rather I should say the Tapestry website had a lot of really interesting documents on it. Because around the same time that Compass received approval for their phase 2 trials, the Tapestry Network's website was totally revamped. All of these white papers were disappeared from the site. Pretty much all of the main players had their biographies rewritten, adjusted, shortened significantly. Supplemental documents disappeared, and there was essentially a major site overhaul. I have a complete backup of the old site. I can't assert certainly that this was done solely because there was this approval and the potential for heightened scrutiny on the website. I just know that these two things happened in close proximity to each other. One of the papers that disappeared that I would contend is perhaps the most interesting and relevant for this discussion is this Beyond the Pill document. Beyond the Pill pretty much deals with this question of how to shape the ecosystem in which one is embedded in order for sustainable advantage. So pretty much how can you make yourself essential, make tons of money, and avoid cannibalizing that particular market. The basic premise is that 10% of healthcare costs are drug purchases. The 90% of healthcare spend is on hospital and what they call the care marketplace. And so while focusing on the fact that companies should identify what chunk of that 90% they can hit, this document asserts that industry has to restore consumer trust. And as to the whys, there are 3 main points. That this is so industry can protect its own franchise, so that industry can become essential to healthcare transformations, and so that they can make sure to take maximum advantage of protecting their franchise and becoming essential to this transformation. And they conclude the section asking the question of why else would this variety of tech companies, Qualcomm, IBM, Apple, Samsung, the rest of them, be investing billions of dollars into healthcare if not to take advantage of the changing rules of the game. And to be sure, as we consider psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, the rules of the game are definitely changing. So the paper goes on to assert that it's crucial that different companies be able to recognize beyond the pill roles, ways of what they call wrapping the pill and not focusing just on drug development. They identify personal medicine and its promise of greater efficacy, so things like genomic biomarkers, ways that you can tailor individual treatments towards specific people, the utilization of predictive artificial intelligence, perhaps through interactions with your smartphone or other wearable technology. And one that I think is particularly interesting is they suggest becoming the go-to expert in particular therapeutic areas, particularly those with emerging standards of care. Now, to me, that screams psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Additionally, they emphasize the early mover advantages that can be gained by getting onto the marketplace, if not first, very soon after the market has emerged. They emphasize the sort of competitive advantages that come from that, the way that you can deny access to other folks, the way that you can sort of develop some of your own strategies before other people have gotten the chance. And they go on to highlight network effects, which are basically, it's a fancy way of saying that goods or services become more valuable when more people use them. So if we think about things like Airbnb, Amazon, Facebook, Uber, we can see both early mover advantages and network effects working together. We can see the fact that as these companies develop, even if they're relatively new, as they enter the terrain and gain sort of a reputation and gain users and gain services and shares of that larger terrain, you're really incentivized to use them. You don't necessarily have good alternatives, and even if they're not operating in traditionally monopolistic ways, they still trend towards monopolistic setups and ultimately keep that terrain restricted to probably themselves, maybe themselves and one major competitor, for example, if we consider like Uber and Lyft. And this document also highlights the issue of focusing on partners of the future. And so basically when talking about healthcare and medical costs, they emphasize that as we get into a greater and greater digital future, that we will see partners that we have not traditionally considered to be involved in healthcare. App developers, social media firms, IT networks, things of that nature. This brings us to a specific partner of the future. MindStrong is a Compass partner, and the tagline might as well be the app that knows you're depressed before you do. Essentially, what this app aims to do is to utilize machine learning based on the way that you interact with your smartphone. So based on the apps that you visit, maybe where you go and what your GPS tracking detects you to be, the sort of words you use, maybe how long you interact with the phone as a whole, specific apps. It essentially attempts to create a profile of you, a digital you, that when you deviate from whatever your norm is, it would ideally like to be able to tell you, hey, you've had such a deviation. To our mind, this indicates fill in the blank. Now, this company was founded by Tom Insel, who's the former director for the National Institute of Mental Health. He's also a member of Compass's Scientific Advisory Board. Now, while he was the head of NIMH, he actually got rid of the DSM-5 as the diagnostic tool for NIMH. He received some praise and some criticism for this, and if you read through his justification, you find, to my mind, quite a bit of reductionist reasoning. Now, to be clear, I'm not a mental health professional, but when I read that mental disorders are biological disorders involving brain circuits that implicate specific domains of cognition, emotion, or behavior, I was pretty appalled to see that there was no further discussion about social impacts or the way that one's environment may influence their mental health. Sure enough, I was able to find a number of criticisms from actual mental health care professionals who were also not particularly thrilled with the reductionist approach that the NIMH was highlighting. Now, I think if we look around the world that we find ourselves in, and if we look at the influence and scandals around things like Facebook manipulating user feeds in order to see what sort of emotional effects they could, or emotional reactions they could affect, if we look at the Cambridge Analytica data breach, if we look at Palantir again, so in addition to all their law enforcement and deportation roles, Palantir also was just awarded a 3-year, $7 million contract for streamlining big health data. I think that there's a lot of really concerning questions about where all of this technology and big data management might end up going. Again, don't really have time to dive into that, but this is just one of Compass's technological partners, and there's quite a few that, to my mind, all have rather interesting implications depending on how far that rabbit hole you'd like to go down. Now, we've already talked about the potential for Maps running sponsored content in the upcoming Winter Bulletin. I would also like to take a moment and raise the question of whether or not they did this at Psychedelic Science 2017. In fact, they ran a panel there that included Paul Summergrad, Tom Insel, and it was moderated by George Goldsmith, all three of whom are currently involved in Compass. Now, there was no elaboration on the role of these figures. There was no discussion about the fact that they all potentially had stake in Compass. And listening to their conversation, I found a number of potentially disturbing things about, for example, app-based healthcare in foreign markets such as India, and they focused specifically at one point in that discussion on the retention or return of user data and what they could potentially do with that. And the way that this was sort of put out there, to me, I found a little bit alarming. Additionally, I was quite surprised when I was reading through Michael Pollan's book, and I found him stating in his last chapter, when I asked conference goers which session they deemed most memorable, almost invariably they mentioned the plenary panel called Future of Psychedelic Psychiatry. Now, I found that rather interesting because this conference featured folks like Kat Harrison, the Mithoffers, Paul Stamets, Dennis McKenna, Gabor Mate, a wide variety of people who are truly foundational and fundamental to these fields of psychedelic science. And to me, the notion that the most memorable panel was this one just seemed kind of odd. Well, when I started talking to researchers and found out that apparently George and Katya had flown Michael Pollan to Isle of Man and had introduced him to some of their research, I found myself a little bit more suspicious, and seeing some of the guerrilla media blitz that seems to be going on around this, combined with the fact that when he was pressed on Compass at the recent Horizon conference, Pollan essentially said, or specifically said, capitalism is a good way to scale things up, and then refused to name Compass by name. All of this seems a little bit alarming to me, but again, you can draw your own conclusions. So to wrap things up, I would assert that Compass doesn't belong on this terrain for a variety of reasons. Mainly, though, because they're taking monopolistic, vertically integrated approaches as espoused by some of their key funders. They're clearly playing for early mover advantage in a virgin market, which we see presented by, again, key investors and in their own white papers. They're interfering with long-standing psychedelic researchers who've been advancing this work since well before there was any profit motive. And I would contend that at the heart of it all, they're commodifying the sacred, and they're representing a significant threat around the privatization of psychedelic knowledge and research, which goes, as I suggested earlier, well beyond acute medical benefits. And if we consider the role that some of this research may play in unlocking understandings around consciousness and fundamental components of our experiences as human beings on this planet, I would suggest that that knowledge has no business being privatized. Thank you.
If we can throw those back in the bin, or if you need our spreads, they're back here. Do you have one to start with?
Okay, so the first question is VC-backed, money over everything, right? That's the quote that I put on the sort of shorthand for how venture capital-backed work. And the response, or the question is, Compass says that's not true in the UK, comment please. So Compass says that that's not true in the UK in Katya's upcoming MAPS bulletin writing. And so, I mean, technically you could argue that it's not true in the US either. The way that it's actually written is something like putting shareholders' interests, I don't remember the exact wording, but you could argue it in a way where it's not necessarily that you have to put money over everything. However, if we think about the way that this works in the real world, when you have a venture capital-backed company, say, for example, as I understand it, I think there's an Italian investment firm that's also involved currently in Compass. I've heard that there's like a teachers union that has their pension involved in that investment. Now, if we think about all of the dynamics from Compass as being set up in order to turn profit, and that teachers union ideally maximizing the value of their pensions, the notion that that teachers union is going to be sympathetic or willing to listen to a group of people saying, hey, please take less money for your pension because we would like to avoid these things being commodified, or we would like to ensure psychedelic therapies being equitable and accessible to everyone, seems unlikely. So there's sort of this, if we look at the logic of the marketplace, and we see that there's a lack of accountability between, and it's understandable, right? I would contend, a lack of accountability between folks who are hoping to get their money out of a financial investment and folks who would like to see perhaps a more equitable price set for the good that is tied to that investment. Those competing values don't actually get resolved in a non-antagonistic way. In fact, according to the logic of the marketplace, that company is incentivized to maximize their profits, and those teachers are incentivized to want to see as much of a return on their profits as possible. So even if it's not true verbatim that it's money over everything, the way that certain aspects of society, of investment, become treated as externalities or are viewed as not being relevant to the actual economic equations, I would contend that in the real world, it functions close enough to that. So if we look, for example, at venture capital-backed UK companies that are invested in extractive industry or logging or really any sort of ecologically degrading practice, we can see that there is no real consideration of the environment, that we don't see them placing ecology over profits in those cases. And so I guess the question to Compass would be what assurances could be provided that somehow Compass will operate fundamentally differently from all of these other real-world examples, even if that's not the letter of the law. So this one says, private individuals who facilitate psychedelic experience for other individuals also perpetuate some of these dynamics by restricting access with huge/classist fees for doing sessions, working with tech and capitalist execs to help them be more creative with no intention towards social liberation, as well as a disregard for cultural and ecological concerns. How do you think we can address that? So that's kind of a huge question, and one that has certainly, I would contend, been persistent throughout much of the last 60 years. And one thing that I would like to believe is that within psychedelic spaces, I mean, within all social spaces, we should be accountable to the folks with which we share those spaces. And so I would hope that when we see projects that function in these ways within our own psychedelic communities, or perhaps within the broader psychedelic community, that we're willing to say something. I know that as I've seen, for example, microdosing gurus pop up, I know that I've tried to be as vocal as possible about highlighting the problems there. I've been speaking publicly on psychedelics for 6 years. For the last 4, pretty much all of my talks have included at least some highlighting of problematic practitioners, because it seems like when I have the opportunity to talk with people in different places, particularly when many of those folks have come across problematic practitioners, there is a desire to talk about that. And so I think that perhaps at the most basic level, one of the things we can do around those types of practitioners and the issues that come up around monetary restrictions and other issues that they sort of parlay in their role in the marketplace is to amplify dialogue about them so that they're not hiding out, so that people who are new to these spaces don't view that as the norm, so that there's not an acceptance of these people as legitimate when they're providing those sorts of services. Something else that I would emphasize that I think is perhaps more productive in a literal sense, rather than just focusing on trying to stop people who you may or may not have any influence over, is that, learn the skills to grow your own, learn the skills to extract your own, learn the skills to share and share alike. And I mean, most of these compounds and plants are pretty easy to source, pretty easy to grow, pretty easy to extract in a variety of climates. I mean, there's folks up in Canada who are growing acacias outdoors for half of the year and moving them in during the winter so that they can then, clip the phyllodes and extract DMT from them. And I would contend that most of these compounds, obviously not talking about LSD or MDMA at the moment, but most of the plant-based entheogens are easy enough to provide to ourselves and those around us that I would contend that if we can grow those networks, if we can make those plants and compounds available to ourselves, our families, our friends, and make known to people that these are experiences that are available, obviously in discrete ways as long as this stuff is criminalized, that it's a really effective way for spreading not only information about these, but the experience itself. And at the point where somebody knows that they can contact a close friend or a close friend of a friend and perhaps gain information or insight to these experiences rather than traveling halfway around the world and shelling out $5,000, I think for a lot of people that's going to be a more welcoming, a more interesting, and potentially a more viable approach. The next one is, Is there an example of any legal substance, i.e. alcohol, vegetables, whatever, that isn't at the mercy of capitalism, tech, and other market forces? And if not, why would psychedelics be any different? What can be done? In other words, aren't the issues bring up endemic to our entire system and all we consume? Absolutely. And I think, so here's the thing. For me, when I look at my own relatively short life, I feel like I look around this world and so much of the things in it have already been commodified in these capitalist systems to, in some cases, like hyper-commodified to absurdly extreme degrees. For me, I think one of the things that feels particularly painful about this happening with regards to psychedelics is that they haven't been yet. And so whether or not it's realistic to view this as a winnable battle, whether or not this is actually different, it's different for the moment. It hasn't happened yet. And it feels to me that there's merit in challenging that. Now, whether or not, like I said, that's a winnable fight is a totally different question, but I'm not excited about anything really that's been commodified. I'm not excited about the fact that my existence, particularly in the US as a globally wealthy person who gets to, my use of modern medicine, my use of my car, all of this is predicated on the destruction of ecosystems, on the subjugation of people elsewhere in the world. I had knee surgery when I was 18, right? The MRI machine that was used for that has rare earth metals that came from China that were mined and refined there, where people bore those costs of extracting them, of living with the waste from those industrial processes. And then that got shipped around halfway across the world to a place where the people who bore those costs are never going to be able to see the benefits of that. And that doesn't make me any more excited than, the notion of psychedelics becoming just another item, another commodity in the marketplace. And so as far as what we can do, I tell people perhaps I'm just super idealistic and naive, but I'm an anti-capitalist in the here and now. So when folks from MAPS tell me this is inevitable and I need to just go with it, I don't know how to do that. And I don't know that that necessarily generates a realistic strategic approach to stopping that. But I do know that there's a whole bunch of other people who seem invested and who seem to care that these things not go that way. And maybe it's a cop-out, but I don't think that I'm the only person capable of coming up with ideas and suggestions around what interference looks like as far as getting in the way of some of these processes. And I think that actually we're a lot stronger when we're able to have dialogues about what we each think might work, what tactics and strategies we've seen in a variety of places. And to that end, to be honest, I don't know that there's the will or desire to see this level of action from psychedelic communities at this precise moment in time. But if we think about some of the animal liberation movement, and if we consider resistance to vivisection labs, right? There exist real-world histories of fairly small groups of people disrupting the economic activities of pretty large corporations. And so I would contend there are strategies that could be deployed if folks were looking at something directly against a particular corporation. I think there's also gentler approaches, right? At this point, it seems like Compass is getting a lot of perceived legitimacy through its relationship with MAPS at this moment. I would contend that MAPS may be receptive to pressure from the broader community, asking why they're doing this, asking how they can justify this. Most of the responses that have come from Compass and from supporters of their actions at MAPS or elsewhere haven't actually been particularly fact-based. They've relied on a bunch of spin, misrepresenting the facts. They've made explicit statements, for example, about the open science, open praxis statement, where they've fundamentally misrepresented what it says, and that's available in text. One of the things I found really effective, at least to whatever degree it's of merit, for internet discussions around this, when some of the Compass defenders say, hey, this is, this article for example, the article that came out in Courts, is misleading and doesn't actually represent the facts, I've asked them to show what they're claiming is misleading, what they're claiming has been misrepresented. So far, none of them have actually come back with any answer, let alone a coherent answer. So I think that to whatever degree we're willing to talk to people and try to put some pressure on some of the folks involved with this, there might be merit to that. I also think, general consciousness raising and talking with friends and family who might be interested in this about what's going on should be of some merit, at least so there's not just a general atmosphere of, oh great, we're seeing progress on legalization or medicalization, this is a default win. How do you see this affecting private personal use as it is now? I don't necessarily see this affecting private personal use significantly. There could be, looking at, I'm not super familiar with the way California has dealt with legalization. I do know there's sort of like a hodgepodge of ordinances and laws that have created interesting patchworks of sort of black market growth, I guess, and distribution. We might see some of that in a legal, regulated market. I think largely, I'm not sure I see a whole lot of effect on the underground as far as things are currently situated, but I don't know for sure. Do you see commodification interfering with underground guerrilla cultivation of mushrooms, production of ayahuasca, extraction of DMT? Pretty much the same question. I suppose it would be interesting to consider, if any of the companies responsible for legal therapeutic pharmaceutical development would be interested in funding legislation that might seek to create problems for folks involved in the underground. But again, I don't know that there's any good model to compare that with. So that would be pure speculation, and I don't want to do too much of that. I think regardless of whether or not we see medicalization or we find ourselves sort of stretching in limbo as Compass and other companies try to do this, there's still pretty significant questions about how successful they'll be. And I think regardless of whether or not they're successful, it would still be to our advantage to disseminate as much information about guerrilla cultivation, extraction, and all of these other things as we can. What then is to be done about it? So, okay, I think we've done that. We can come back to that more in community discussion because I hope that other people have thoughts and ideas and things they'd like to see implemented. And this one says, in regards to patenting, indigenous people, rights of medical inventions. 2, case of psilocybin from the perspective of traditional knowledge and patent technology rights. 3, Mexico and Mazatec people perhaps can bring a case against Compass. Your thoughts? I'm not particularly clear on patent law. I'm sorry. I was talking with somebody about, so one of the questions that comes up, right, is this transition of intellectual property from the nonprofit to the for-profit, depending on what that property looks like. I think Koch has made some assertions about what that is in the upcoming bulletin. How much that matches reality is a question. I do think that it would be interesting, and a question that I raised that I don't know that it has any legal merit whatsoever, is one of, if there's been some sort of misrepresentation along those lines, could, whether it's indigenous folks or people from the underground, sort of present themselves as an injured party by the privatization of this intellectual property and try to mount some sort of defense against that. I think also it's worth noting Compass has a patent, or Compass has applied for a methods patent for their particular synthesis of psilocybin. Some chemists that I've talked to have kind of laughed at it because it's a methods patent, and their assertion is when you've got a kilo of GMP psilocybin sitting in front of you, who's going to tell you what method was used to produce it? So from that, I think it's worth noting that it seems that it's less about that patent per se, and more about the fact that Compass has like 38 million in the bank, MAPS has something like 17 million, and nobody else comes close. So in that context, if Compass has significant funds for patent litigation and nobody else does, is there the possibility that we see sort of frivolous patent lawsuits akin to those we see from patent trolls, not so much to defend valid intellectual property as much as to try to keep other people off the terrain, hamstring people the same way their exclusivity agreement has, and really operate in a way to give them as much competitive advantage as possible. I forgot to mention it earlier, but it's worth noting that exclusivity agreement for their psilocybin was put through at a point where they weren't ready to conduct research. The teams that had been assembled by other institutions were ready to roll. Theirs were not, and so I think it's really clear and simple to make the case that Compass is very much interested in interfering with other research groups in order so they can get ahead. And I think that's it for these questions, so I guess we can get into some unrecorded conversation.